On a quiet evening in 2022, deputies in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, forced their way into a locked bedroom and found 32-year-old Samara Trent sitting in silence, her 2 children hidden in another room, and her mother-in-law dead in the living room. Just minutes earlier, a single gunshot had torn through the house, ending what was supposed to be a confrontation about her husband's double life. The man at the center of it all had fled, leaving behind a scene so fractured that detectives would later describe it as one of the most chaotic domestic shootings they had ever handled. At the heart of the tragedy was not a break-in, not a robbery, but a family dispute that spiraled into bloodshed the moment betrayal, depression, and secrecy collided. What began as a mother's attempt to correct her son's mistake ended with her lying lifeless on her daughter-in-law's floor. Samara Johnson met Theron Trent in Charlotte, North Carolina, in 2016. She was working as an administrative assistant at a medical billing firm, and he was employed with a construction company that handled regional contracts. Their relationship moved quickly, and within a year, the two decided to marry. On the surface, their wedding in Mecklenburg County looked like the beginning of a stable family unit, but fissures began to appear almost immediately. At the center of those early tensions was Theron's mother, Evelina Trent, a longtime resident of Cabarrus County. Evelina was known in her church as a stern but respected woman, someone who valued tradition and had clear expectations for her children. She was protective of Theron, her only son, and believed strongly in being involved in his household. From the start, that involvement clashed with Samara's desire for independence. During their first months of marriage, Evelina made frequent visits to the couple's Charlotte apartment, sometimes unannounced. She offered advice on everything from household budgets to childcare before there were children, even weighing in on their grocery spending. To Samara, those gestures felt less like support and more like intrusion. Tension erupted when she told Theron that his mother's constant presence was stifling their ability to build a life together. The matter came to a head after a holiday dinner in late 2017. Evelina had voiced her disapproval of Samara's decision to continue working rather than focusing on starting a family immediately. Samara, who had never been one to hold back, responded firmly that her marriage was between herself and Theron, not between her and his mother. According to relatives who were present, the room fell silent. From that day forward, Evelina reduced her visits dramatically. On the outside, that shift looked like compromise, but in truth, it only deepened the divide. Evelina stepped back, but she carried a quiet resentment. She continued to see Theron regularly in Cabarrus County, where she lived, but rarely engaged directly with Samara. Their contact became limited to brief exchanges at family gatherings, birthdays, and holidays. Even when the couple welcomed their first child, Evelina's excitement was tempered. She would see her grandson, Nyson, when Theron brought him over, but she seldom entered Samara's home again. By 2019, the Trents had settled into a rhythm that kept Evelina on the periphery. To neighbors in Charlotte's East Side, they appeared like any young couple raising a family. Behind closed doors, however, the separation between wife and mother-in-law was stark. Evelina maintained her pride, convinced she was respecting Samara's wishes by keeping her distance. Samara, in turn, believed she had drawn a necessary line to protect her household. By the spring of 2021, the Trent household looked stable from the outside. Samara and Theron were living in a modest rental home near Albemarle Road in East Charlotte, raising their son, Nyson, who was then 3 years old. In April, their daughter, Ariel, was born at Novant Health Presbyterian Medical Center. Family friends remembered the early weeks as joyful, with neighbors stopping by to congratulate the young couple. But beneath the surface, strain was already beginning to take hold. Samara's recovery after childbirth was not easy. By the summer, those close to her began noticing shifts in her behavior. She grew irritable, often snapping at Theron for small issues. Some days she struggled to get out of bed, leaving household chores and childcare to pile up. Other times she seemed restless, staying awake late into the night while the children slept. Medical professionals later described her condition as consistent with postpartum depression, a disorder that can strike women in the months following childbirth and leave them vulnerable to unpredictable changes in mood and energy. Theron, however, was ill-equipped to handle the challenges that came with Samara's condition. Instead of responding with patience or empathy, he grew frustrated. He had entered fatherhood expecting a wife who would hold the household together while he worked long hours with his construction crew. What he found instead was a partner who seemed absent and, at times, combative. Friends recalled him complaining during after-work gatherings that Samara just wasn't the same anymore. The reality inside the Trent home was more complicated. Depression clouded Samara's ability to manage daily life, leaving her emotionally detached from Theron. At times she would lash out, accusing him of being unsupportive or questioning his late arrival's home. Their arguments grew louder and more frequent, often spilling into the night after the children were asleep. On weekends, instead of enjoying family outings, they found themselves locked in cold silences or bitter exchanges. By late 2021, those cracks began to widen. Samara's attempts to seek help were inconsistent. She attended one postpartum support group at a clinic near Plaza Midwood but never returned for follow-ups. Meanwhile, Theron withdrew further. He began spending more time away from the house under the pretense of long shifts and side jobs. He claimed he was picking up overtime to cover the growing costs of raising 2 young children, but in truth, he was distancing himself from the turmoil inside his home. For the children, the atmosphere was unstable. Nyson, old enough to sense the tension, grew clingy with Samara during her darker spells, while Ariel, still an infant, became a point of strain as nights of interrupted sleep only sharpened the couple's exhaustion. Neighbors reported hearing arguments echoing through the walls on more than one occasion, though police were never called to the address during that time. By the time Ariel's first birthday approached in 2022, the Trents' marriage was no longer defined by partnership. It was marked by distance, Samara lost in the shadows of depression, and Theron finding reasons to stay away. That growing gap in their marriage left room for betrayal to take root, a betrayal that would draw Evelina back into the family's orbit in a way none of them expected. By early 2022, Theron Trent's absences from home became routine. He told Samara he needed to make regular trips to Cabarrus County to help his mother with small errands and home maintenance. On paper, the explanation was believable. Evelina was in her late 50s, living alone in a modest single-story house outside Concord, and she often relied on her son for. Within Evelina's church community, Theron had crossed paths with Corliss Dade, a 28-year-old single mother who attended services there. Corliss was raising her young son with limited support, and over time, she developed a friendship with Theron that slipped quickly into an affair. Evelina initially believed her son was coming to spend time with her, but she noticed his visits had grown shorter and his attention seemed elsewhere. He would arrive, linger briefly, and then leave for unexplained stretches of time before returning to collect his tools or head back to Charlotte. The relationship with Corliss deepened rapidly. While Samara struggled with postpartum depression at home, Theron sought the comfort of a woman who gave him the admiration he no longer felt in his marriage. Corliss, for her part, saw Theron as an escape from her own isolation. Their meetings were discreet but not invisible. Congregants of the church quietly noted the pair spending time together outside of Sunday services. Evelina herself began to take notice. When she confronted Theron directly in the spring of 2022, he dismissed her concerns. He claimed there was nothing between them, that Corliss was simply a friend who leaned on him for help. Evelina, who had a reputation in her church for being outspoken, was not easily convinced. Her suspicions grew, though she chose not to press further at the time. She remained wary of interfering in her son's marriage after the cold reception she had received from Samara years earlier. Corliss's role in Theron's life only grew. He began helping her with groceries, offering rides, and providing small amounts of money when she fell short on bills. Their affair was no longer confined to secrecy in Cabarrus County. Occasional sightings placed them together in neighboring Canapolis, further fueling Evelina's suspicion. Still, Samara remained unaware of the full extent of her husband's double life. This secret would not stay hidden for long. Corliss's situation was becoming more complicated, and by the summer of 2022, what began as an affair was about to spiral into a crisis with consequences far beyond Theron's control. Evelina, determined to protect her family standing, would soon be forced into the middle of it, setting in motion a chain of events that no one in the Trent family could reverse. In July 2022, the truth that Theron Trent had tried to bury forced its way to the surface. Corliss Dade, the single mother from Evelina's church, learned she was pregnant. What had begun as a relationship carried on in secret could no longer be hidden. For Corliss, the discovery came with fear as well as expectation. She believed Theron would be forced to face the reality of their connection, perhaps even support her through the pregnancy. But Theron had no interest in accountability. When Corliss told him, his response was silence. Calls went unanswered, messages ignored. On the rare occasion he did pick up, he offered vague promises that he would handle things, before quickly ending the conversation. Days stretched into weeks, and Corliss grew more desperate. She was carrying his child but felt abandoned, trapped in a situation she could not navigate alone. With nowhere else to turn, Corliss sought out the one person she believed could not ignore her, Evelina. One humid Sunday afternoon after church in Concord, she waited outside Evelina's home. When the older woman arrived from a service, Corliss told her everything. She explained that she was pregnant, that Theron had stopped responding, and that she could not manage this on her own. The news struck Evelina like a blow. She had suspected her son's involvement with Corliss for months, but hearing confirmation and learning of the pregnancy was devastating. In her church, such a scandal was not only a personal failure but a public humiliation. Evelina had built her life on respectability, on the appearance of order and discipline, and now she was faced with the knowledge that her only son had fathered a child outside his marriage with a woman from her own congregation. She was horrified by the betrayal of Samara, who was already raising 2 young children under difficult circumstances. Evelina made up her mind. If Theron refused to confront his mistake, she would force him to. In her view, silence was no longer an option. The damage was done, but she could not allow her son to evade responsibility, leaving a young woman and unborn child adrift. As she saw it, a confrontation was the only path left, one that would make Theron face what he had done and force Samara to see the truth that had been unfolding behind her back. In late August 2022, Evelina told Corliss to get in her car. They were going to Charlotte. Corliss, nervous but hopeful that Theron would finally acknowledge her, agreed. Evelina drove with determination, leaving her Concord neighborhood and heading straight for the Trent household on Albemarle Road. She had avoided that house for years, respecting Samara's boundary, but this time she believed she had no choice. What Evelina could not have known was how volatile the situation inside that home already was. Samara and Theron's marriage had reached a breaking point, marked by shouting matches and mistrust. Evelina thought she was bringing clarity, forcing accountability. Instead, her decision to arrive unannounced with Corliss would ignite the most explosive moment of her family's history. Within hours, what began as a mother's attempt to set her son straight would leave her fatally shot in her daughter-in-law's living room. The drive itself was quiet, but tense. Evelina kept her eyes fixed on the road, her jaw set, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Corliss sat in the passenger seat, fidgeting, unsure whether this was the best way forward. She had not wanted the situation to reach this point, but she also wanted Theron to stop ignoring her existence. At that moment, both women believed they were walking into a necessary confrontation. Difficult, yes, but perhaps the only way to break through Theron's wall of denial. By the time Evelina's car turned onto Albemarle Road in East Charlotte, Samara and Theron were already locked in yet another argument. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices spilling out from the Trent home that afternoon. Inside, Samara's frustration over Theron's absences had boiled over. She accused him of neglect, of abandoning her and the children during the most vulnerable time of her life. Theron, weary of the constant conflict, deflected and grew defensive. Their fight was reaching a peak just as Evelina's vehicle pulled into the driveway. Evelina did not announce her arrival ahead of time. She parked, exited the car with Corliss, and walked straight toward the house. With Corliss trailing reluctantly behind, Evelina opened the door and stepped directly into the storm. What she found was a scene already unraveling. Samara and Theron shouting across the living room, voices sharp and bitter. Evelina's entrance only heightened the tension. She called for calm, urging both to stop, before revealing the purpose of her visit. Gesturing toward Corliss, she told her son that his denial was over, that the woman standing beside her was carrying his child, and it was time for him to do the right thing. The effect was immediate. The room fell into stunned silence before erupting again, this time with even greater fury. Samara's face twisted with shock and betrayal. Theron tried to explain, his words tumbling out in fragments, while Corliss stood awkwardly near the doorway, overwhelmed by the eruption she had been dragged into. Evelina, convinced she was bringing resolution, had instead poured gasoline onto a fire that was already burning out of control. In that moment, what had been intended as a corrective intervention transformed into the spark for disaster. The walls of the Trent home, once witness to private arguments, now bore the weight of a public exposure that none of them were ready to face. Within minutes, the confrontation would spiral into violence, and Evelina's decision to force accountability would cost her far more than she had ever imagined. Samara's fury turned from her husband to her mother-in-law. The woman who had kept her distance, who had never embraced her as part of the family, now stood in her living room dictating terms, bringing another woman to replace her. Every buried slight, every moment of rejection over the past 6 years surged back with crushing force. She shouted that Evelina had no right to stand in her home, no right to speak over her, no right to parade another woman as her husband's salvation. The atmosphere was combustible. Every gesture, every word, every glance carried the weight of years of mistrust. Theron moved closer to the door, searching for escape. Corliss hovered by the frame, wishing she could vanish. Evelina stood firm, but the tension thickened around her. And Samara, consumed by rage and humiliation, stood on the edge of a decision that would turn an ugly argument into an irreversible tragedy. In that chaos, Samara's eyes darted toward a handgun kept in the house. The firearm, a black 9mm pistol, had been purchased months earlier by Theron under the justification of home protection. It was usually tucked away in a drawer near the hallway, out of sight but never out of reach. Now, in the heat of the confrontation, Samara moved for it. She gripped the weapon with both hands, her movements frantic and unsteady. She did not announce her intent. The gun itself was the statement. Her rage was directed at Theron, her voice breaking as she accused him of humiliating her, of abandoning her when she needed him most, of desecrating their marriage in front of his mother and another woman. Evelina stepped forward, insisting that bringing a gun into the argument would solve nothing. But in the swirl of shouts, tears, and insults, control evaporated. A single shot rang out. The sound echoed through the house, shattering the argument mid-sentence. Evelina staggered backward, her hand instinctively clutching her chest. The bullet had struck her just above the sternum. She collapsed to the floor within seconds, her body crumpling near the edge of the living room rug. The force of her fall sent Corliss stumbling sideways, her hand flying to her mouth as she gasped in horror. For a moment, silence consumed the room. The fury that had filled the air only seconds earlier evaporated, replaced by the ringing in their ears and the sight of Evelina's body on the floor. Samara froze, the gun slipping from her hands and clattering onto the hardwood. Her chest still rose and fell rapidly, but her voice was gone. She stared at what she had done, her expression blank, as though she could not process the reality before her. Theron was the first to move. Without looking back, he bolted through the front door and disappeared into the yard, leaving his wife, his mother, and Corliss behind. His escape was not accompanied by words or explanation, only the sound of his shoes pounding the pavement as he fled. Corliss remained, paralyzed by the scene. Moments earlier, she had imagined this confrontation might bring clarity or at least force acknowledgement. Instead, she now stood over the lifeless body of the woman who had brought her here, the only person who had defended her when Theron refused to. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but her instincts finally pushed her into action. She fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers, her voice breaking as she told the dispatcher what had happened. Inside, Samara stumbled backward, retreating down the hallway. She left the gun where it fell, stepped into the master bedroom, and locked the door behind her. Outside, the first sirens began to echo down the road. The call had been flagged as an active shooting, and patrol cars from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department converged on the neighborhood within minutes. Officers found Corliss waving them down frantically from the porch, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling with adrenaline. She pointed them inside, shouting that the shooter was still locked in the bedroom. The officers entered cautiously, weapons drawn. They found Evelina's body just as Corliss had described. One officer remained with her, gathering fragments of information, while others moved down the hallway toward the locked door. They knocked, ordered Samara to open it, and received no response. After repeated commands, they forced the door open to find her seated on the bed, staring blankly ahead, unresponsive to their shouts. Samara offered no resistance as they handcuffed her. She barely seemed to acknowledge their presence. Officers described her as pale, trembling, and detached, her eyes glassy as though she were disconnected from the chaos unfolding around her. By the time paramedics arrived, Evelina was pronounced dead at the scene. Corliss, still shaken, provided the first coherent account of what had happened: the confrontation, the shouting, the gunshot, and Theron's flight. Detectives began canvassing the neighborhood almost immediately, gathering witness statements and tracking down the man who had fled on foot. What remained inside the Trent home was the aftermath of a family torn apart. A mother-in-law who had stepped in to force accountability now lay dead. A wife sat in custody, her silence as heavy as the charges about to be filed. A mistress had become an unwitting witness to a killing she never expected to see. And a husband was on the run, his disappearance only deepening the suspicion that nothing in the Trent family had ever been as stable as it appeared. The house quickly shifted from chaos to methodical procedure. Detectives secured the handgun from the floor, bagged it, and marked the position of Evelina's body for the crime scene technicians. Corliss stayed, still trembling, gave a halting account to investigators. Evelina had driven her there to confront Theron about the pregnancy. An argument erupted, Samara grabbed the gun, and a single shot struck Evelina. The details spilled out in fragments, interrupted by sobs, but they gave detectives their first clear outline of what had happened. Meanwhile, Theron was tracked down hours later. Witnesses had seen him fleeing the neighborhood, and officers eventually located him at a friend's apartment in northeast Charlotte. He was taken in for questioning but not arrested at that moment. His account was defensive, shifting blame onto Samara's behavior and her instability since the birth of their second child. Detectives pressed him about Corliss, the affair, and the pregnancy. At first he denied involvement, then contradicted himself under questioning, finally conceding that the relationship had gone further than he intended. His evasions only deepened investigators' suspicion of his role in the events leading up to Evelina's death. Samara, booked into the Mecklenburg County Detention Center, remained largely silent during her initial interrogation. She answered only basic questions: her name, her children's ages, where the gun was kept in the house. When pressed about the shooting itself, she lowered her head and said nothing. Detectives noted her condition, later bringing in mental health professionals to evaluate her state. Postpartum depression was flagged as a significant factor, but it did not change the fact that she had pulled the trigger. As the investigation unfolded, the threads of betrayal and neglect came into view. Detectives pieced together the timeline: Samara's postpartum struggles in 2021, Theron's growing absences, his secret involvement with Corliss, Evelina's suspicions, and finally her decision to bring Corliss to the house that day. What emerged was a portrait of a family collapsing under layers of deception and mistrust, each decision compounding the last until the outcome became inevitable. Evidence supported the accounts. Phone records showed repeated calls and texts from Corliss to Theron in the weeks before the shooting, most unanswered. Bank statements revealed Theron had withdrawn cash on multiple occasions in Cabarrus County, consistent with Corliss's testimony that he provided her small amounts of support. Neighbors reported hearing frequent arguments between Samara and Theron in the months leading up to September, though none had expected violence of this magnitude. The image of Evelina also came into sharper focus. Interviews with church members in Concord confirmed her growing suspicion about her son's relationship with Corliss. Several said she had voiced worry about the family's reputation and her son's choices. For detectives, that painted a picture of a woman who, though distant from her daughter-in-law, had still taken it upon herself to intervene when she believed her son had gone too far. By the end of September, prosecutors prepared their case. Samara faced charges of second-degree murder and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Her defense team signaled early that they would lean on her postpartum mental health struggles as context, if not justification. Theron, though not charged in connection with the shooting, found his credibility shredded in the public record of interviews and statements. Corliss, now visibly pregnant, became a reluctant but essential witness to the sequence of events. The trial of Samara Trent opened in February 2023 at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse in Uptown Charlotte. Interest was immediate. Court records showed a young mother accused of killing her mother-in-law inside her own home, with betrayal, infidelity, and postpartum depression woven into the case. The prosecution moved swiftly to frame Samara as a jealous, unstable woman who had turned to violence when confronted with her husband's affair. The assistant district attorney told jurors in her opening statement that this was not a tragic accident. It was rage, humiliation, and control exploding in the worst way possible. The prosecution built its case on Corliss Dade's testimony. Now visibly pregnant, she described how Evelina had insisted on driving her to Charlotte that day, determined to confront her son. Her account of the shouting match, the gun, and Evelina collapsing in front of her painted a vivid picture of chaos turned deadly. Corliss admitted she never expected the situation to spiral into violence, but she told jurors that Samara's anger was unmistakable and overwhelming. Investigators bolstered the testimony with evidence: the handgun recovered from the living room, ballistic confirmation of a single fired round, and witness statements from neighbors who heard yelling before the shot. Phone records and financial statements tied Theron to Corliss, proving a pattern of contact and support inconsistent with his early denials. Theron himself took the stand reluctantly. His credibility unraveled quickly under cross-examination. Prosecutors highlighted his lies to investigators, his affair with Corliss, and his decision to flee the house moments after his mother was shot. To the jury, he appeared less a victim of circumstance and more a man whose betrayal and cowardice had detonated his family. Samara's defense focused on her mental state. They presented medical records from Novant Health showing her postpartum diagnosis after Ariel's birth, and brought in an expert witness who testified about how untreated depression could heighten emotional instability. The defense argued that Samara had never intended to kill Evelina, that the gun was brandished in the heat of a breakdown, not as part of a plan. They pointed to her immediate silence, her refusal to flee, and her dazed demeanor when officers entered the bedroom as signs of a woman overwhelmed, not calculating. The courtroom became a forum for a family's failures. Samara's supporters emphasized that she had been left to raise 2 children while her husband drifted into infidelity. Evelina's friends from Concord filled benches, mourning a woman who had died trying to impose accountability on her son. Corliss, caught in the middle, drew both sympathy and blame, sympathy for being abandoned by Theron, blame for being the flashpoint that exposed the family's fracture. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than a day. In March 2023, they returned a verdict of guilty of voluntary manslaughter and guilty of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The judge, weighing her postpartum struggles against the gravity of taking a life, sentenced Samara to 12 to 15 years in prison. The sentence left her eligible for parole in her early 40s, but it also ensured her children would grow up without her at home. Custody of Nyson and Ariel was awarded to Samara's relatives on her side of the family, with court-ordered supervision given the highly public nature of the case. Theron, though never charged in connection with the shooting, found his reputation ruined. His role in the affair, his lies to investigators, and his flight from the scene stripped him of credibility. By the end of 2023, he had moved out of Charlotte entirely, his name a reminder of scandal and disgrace. For the Trent family, there was no restoration. Evelina was gone, Samara was behind bars, Corliss was raising a child fathered by a man who no longer stood by her, and 2 young children were left to grow up with the shadow of that September afternoon. What began as an argument about fidelity and responsibility had ended in a living room shooting that destroyed 3 generations at once. The story closed not with reconciliation, but with silence. A mother dead, a daughter-in-law imprisoned, and a son whose actions had set the tragedy in motion left standing alone, disgraced and stripped of everything he claimed to protect.